Incident at Hawks Hill by Alan W. Eckert. Chapter 12. The reaction when the three McDonalds reached the Hawks Hill farm was no less emotional. Coral was first to see them coming, and she stood before the house paralyzed with astonishment for a moment. Then the spell broke, and she screamed piercingly, "Mama! Mama!" She ran into the house, still screaming, "It's Ben, Mama! They found him! It's Ben! And he's alive!" Coral raced back outside with Esther on her heels, and Beth close behind them. They stopped in the middle of the yard, all three of them crying, and waited as the sweat-soaked horses plodded up and came to a stop. Esther, murmuring her youngest's name, reached up to take him from John. The little boy only clung tighter. "Easy, Esther," William said gently. "He's all right. Let John get down with him. He's scared." She put a hand to her mouth and stepped back, suddenly alarmed without really knowing why. The whip was still trailing from John's grip, and realizing it, the older youth let it drop to the ground. MacDonald dismounted and took the reins from John, then reached up with one hand and helped him dismount with Ben. The elder MacDonald led the horses over to the nearby fence and looped the reins around the top rail. By the time he turned back, John had managed to get Ben's feet on the ground and disengage his grip. Ben crouched and backed away a little, like a wild animal at bay and snarling faintly. Both Coral and Beth gasped, and Esther moaned as if in pain. The child was in unspeakable condition. The wildness of his hair, now grown long and filthy, accentuated the furtive wildness in his eyes. His shirt was little more than rags, and his trousers were even worse, with one leg ripped away at the knee and the other in tatters. He was barefooted, and wherever his skin showed, face, neck, body, arms, legs, and feet, he was grimy with dirt. His legs and arms were crisscrossed with scratches, some new, others in various stages of healing, and his lips were severely cracked. He was terribly thin, even more so than before, and he didn't look at all well. His eyes darted back and forth, as if seeking some way to escape. "Oh, Ben, Ben," Esther came forward to take him, but he lurched back from her and startled her with a savage, hissing growl, and bared his teeth in a snarl. She looked at William helplessly. "Let me, Mama." John stepped forward and stooped and held his arms out to Ben. A snarl met him, but he came closer, still holding out his hands. Ben looked at the hands, and then, for the first time, directly at John's face. The snarling stopped, and he moved toward the older boy. Very carefully, John touched Ben's arm, and then slipped his own arm around the little boy's waist. "Come on, Ben," he said softly. "You're home now. Let me take you inside." He gathered his little brother into his arms, and Ben clung tightly to him, once again hiding his face in John's shirt front. "I don't understand," Esther murmured, as she and William and the girls followed behind John into the house. How could he stay alive so long by himself out there?" MacDonald only shrugged. He had been pondering the same question, and it just didn't seem possible. John carried his brother into the parlor and put him down in the middle of the floor. When he disengaged Ben's grip and stepped back, again there was that momentary wild look in Ben's eyes. The boy darted glances at the tables and chairs, at the fireplace with the rifle and crossed swords hung over the mantel. He stared at the lamps and pictures and furnishings, and then one by one at the people in the room. His nostrils dilated as he sniffed the smells once so familiar, spices and fresh bread, meat cooking and warm milk. The wild look faded, and he frowned. His mouth opened and shut, and then opened again. For a short while longer he stood there, and then, as if a switch had suddenly been thrown, everything seemed to register at once. His face screwed up, and he wailed, and then stumbled toward Esther, crying, "Mama, Mama, Mama!" She hugged him to her, lifting him up and rocking back and forth with him, murmuring to him and kissing him, the tears she shed falling on him and streaking his dirty skin. He clung to her with a sort of desperation, his own tears mingling with hers, and he made no effort now to shrink from the touches of the other members of the family as they crowded around and patted him and smiled and wept. It was MacDonald who expressed what all of them felt when he put his fingers under Ben's chin and tilted the boy's head to kiss the smudged cheek. "Welcome home, Ben," he said. "Welcome home, son." The day's excitement was far from over. Hardly had the family begun to regain its composure, as John was just telling them how he had fought off the badger by the hole, when from the doorway there came a new hissing and snarling. Wheezing and panting from her long run, her hackles standing upright as she glared and growled at them and curled her lips back from powerful teeth, the female badger crouched on the doorsill. Both John and his father shouted warnings simultaneously. The girls screamed and drew back fearfully. In 3 steps, MacDonald was at the fireplace and had snatched the heavy Henry repeating rifle from its pegs. Now it was Ben who screamed, and even as his father raised the gun, he jerked free from Esther's grasp and uttered a strange chattering sound as he ran to the badger and flung his arms around her neck, shielding her body with his own. The big animal licked his cheek briefly, but continued the threatening growls directed at the family. MacDonald still held the gun poised to fire as soon as Ben should get out of the way, but now Esther moved to him and gently pushed the muzzle upward and shook her head. "No, Will," she said. "I don't understand it, but she's Ben's, or he's hers. Whichever, she's just trying to protect him. Look at them." Ben, uttering a low, continuing chatter, was still hugging her around the neck with one arm, stroking her with his other hand, and had now leaned his head against hers. While still wheezing and grunting somewhat, the badger had settled down considerably, though it was still evident that she was extremely nervous, being so near to these humans. MacDonald nodded wonderingly, and John muttered more to himself than to anyone else. Who would have believed it? It was the beginning of an unusually difficult time of another sort, but little by little the female badger became a member of the MacDonald family. She would permit no other person than Ben to touch her, but with him she could not have been more gentle. The two were together constantly, and Ben even refused to sleep in his bed, choosing instead to curl up with her on the floor in his bedroom, and sleep with his arm protectively over her on the matting that had been provided for her. Now it was Ben, cleaned and doctored and recuperating well under Esther's care, who cared for the badger, feeding her and protecting her, as she had done for him at the den. She adapted remarkably well to this way of life. The door was always left open so that she could come and go as she pleased, but she always stayed near Ben and ate only what he gave her. At first she snarled frighteningly whenever anyone came near the boy, but Ben would chatter at her in a scolding manner, and by the 3rd day she seemed to have come to an acceptance of the fact that they meant no harm to him, and she no longer bridled at their approach to him. An understanding had quickly been reached in the family that they would let this matter run its course, whatever it might be. Esther was obsessed with the belief that if anything happened to the badger, it would be Ben who suffered, as she told William late one night after the rest were asleep. "I don't know how it'll end, Will. I don't have any idea. All I know is that we have Ben back now, and that's worth anything. If he wants to keep her as a pet until she falls dead with old age, then we'll let him. Oh, William, he's all tied up with her some way, and we've got to try to understand. And even if we don't understand, we've got to try to help." For a week, Ben alternated between 2 lives, sometimes running around on all fours, growling, hissing, chattering, and tussling with the badger, as they played a sort of King of the Hill game on the earth pile near the house, where the well was being dug, and at other times talking with his family and acting like any other little boy his age. This was the thing most surprising to them, for Ben was now talking to them, all of them, as he never had before, and it was obvious that he was enjoying the way they listened to him. For the first time in his life, Ben had important things to say, things people were eager to hear. And what they wanted to know most, of course, were the details of what had happened during his absence. He told them, not exactly chronologically, perhaps, because it was all sort of muddled together to him, but he related incident after incident of getting lost, of taking refuge from the storm in the badger hole, of his meeting with the animal. For the first time they learned how he had touched her initially in the prairie, some time before his disappearance, and of her adoption of him. He was pleased at their amazement when he told of cleansing her wounded paw by licking it, and with their evident awe when he told how she had offered her milk to him, and then when he refused it, had brought him prairie chicken eggs and creatures she caught. They managed not to appear too shocked when he told them of what he had eaten, and when he related how he had hidden from George Burton that first morning after the night storm, not realizing that Burton was one member of the search party seeking him. They were better able to understand why no one had seen any sign of him after that, even though He had seen a number of horsemen, and it was much easier to understand, too, why he had fled at John's approach, and even fought him when he was discovered. What perhaps astounded them most was his story about the death of Lobo, and for the first time they began to believe he was fabricating much of what he was telling them. How could their shy, extremely timid little son attack and bite a fearsome animal like that big yellow-gray dog? And that he and the badger together could have killed it was wholly beyond belief. But when John strode out to get his rifle where it was still stuck in the ground, he was gone a long time, and he was wet when he returned. He took his parents aside, and in an odd whisper he told them he had gone to the pothole where Ben had said the fight took place. He had searched and finally found the decomposing body of the dog, just where Ben had said it would be. I looked it over pretty well, John concluded, lowering his voice even more. Mama, Dad, you wouldn't have believed it. The dog's throat was just ripped to shreds, and I looked at his hind leg, too, and it was bitten badly. It was the last time they doubted what Ben told them. As his accounts continued and expanded, the degree of vocabulary Ben possessed impressed and astounded them, especially in view of the fact that he had always been so monosyllabic in his speech before. It was evident now that while he had previously not spoken much, he had listened much better than anyone thought, and had learned from the family's conversation around him. And though he weighed somewhat less than when he left, he had somehow, in his own eyes and in theirs, grown considerably. His pride in this feeling was evident in one of his comments. I used to be so small when everyone else was so big, he told them seriously. It was like everybody, even Coral and Beth, knew more than I did, and there wasn't anything I could say that everybody didn't know already. But now I know a lot of things that nobody else knows, don't I? He did it indeed. And as they gradually fitted Ben's story together in its proper order, the things that had happened to him seemed all the more incredible, and they realized only too well that if such a story became publicly known, Ben would never be able to lead any kind of normal life. He would be pointed out ever after as a curiosity, a freak, and be called names like Badger Boy, or worse. With school very soon to begin for him, he would become the butt of merciless teasing, and he would not be given the chance he needed to fit in with the community life here. The dilemma was solved in a way which Esther could only describe as providential. On the 6th evening after Ben's return, by which time most of his story had been assimilated by the family, 2 visitors stopped by the residence on Hawks Hill. One was Doc Simpson, Dr. Richard M. Simpson of North Corners, who had joined in the initial search for Ben, and then came back after a day's absence to help the family search for 3 more days. The other was the Archbishop, Peter Matheson of Winnipeg, who had come to pay a visit to his doctor friend in North Corners. Doc Simpson had given the Archbishop more of the particulars of the MacDonald boys' disappearance, of which the clergyman had heard only sketchy details in Winnipeg. Being this close to where the MacDonalds lived, Archbishop Matheson had asked Doc Simpson if he would mind driving him there in his buggy, so he could talk with the family and perhaps comfort them to some degree in their loss. And so the 2 men had come to visit, and were more than astounded to find Ben there. The whole story came out, along with the ramifications of what would occur if it ever became public knowledge. The Archbishop sat back and rubbed his chin thoughtfully for a time, and then cleared his throat. I would not hesitate in the least to say that we have seen here the manifestation of God's hand. This remarkable incident and the change in the child since his return bears all the earmarks of a divine intervention. I do believe it might be termed something of a minor miracle, and perhaps not so minor at that. Don't you agree, Richard? Doc Simpson nodded, removed the pipe from between his teeth, and said, I couldn't agree with you more. Quite frankly, if it had been hearsay, I wouldn't have believed it. He pointed the pipe stem at the bedroom where Ben and the badger were sleeping and added, Suffice to say, I'm convinced of it. The Archbishop nodded and continued, directing his remarks to Esther and William MacDonald. It's not the purpose of the church, he said, to encourage the dissemination of a falsehood, regardless of the good intentions it fosters. Yet neither is it the purpose of the church to needlessly and pointlessly inflict harm, mentally or physically. He paused again to put his thoughts in order, and then, choosing his words carefully, continued. In the 3 years of his preachment, the Savior told many stories, which in those days were called parables. While they might have been true, they were not necessarily so, but neither were they lies in the sense of deliberate and malicious prevarication. They were simply parables, stories told with a point, to put across in a more acceptable, meaningful way than by simply stating a fact. In your case, Mr. and Mrs. MacDonald, I would say, and I believe the good doctor would second me, that a parable under these circumstances would be more appropriate, and, as parables are, more valuable than mere hard facts. This would be the parable of a small lost child, caught in the grip of the elements, frightened and bewildered, in some respects like the lost lamb of the shepherd's flock. Now then, Richard, he said, turning towards the doctor again, since you are familiar with the speech, what is the Indian name for the badger? Several of them, Simpson replied, depending on tribe and dialect. One is Ithapute, and another is Midinusk. Then the archbishop raised a hand and stopped him. That second one will suffice. So getting back to our parable, we have a little lost boy caught in the elements, and in this dire predicament he is found by one named Mittendusk, who shares home and food with him, protects him, watches over him, even adopts him, until at last he can be reunited with his grieving family, who, like the Good Shepherd, have refused to give him up for lost. It is a good parable, he said, nodding, and it is simple, just as an effective parable should be. It also makes a good point, this being that even under the most dreadful of circumstances, there is one who watches over us all, and who can and will, given the chance and the belief, protect and preserve us. I do not, he cleared his throat again, say this lightly. It is the foundation of my belief and the rock upon which the church is built. Providence? Divine intervention? Indeed, I have no doubt of it. Can you conceive of any other way a 6-year-old child, unusually small for his age at that, could survive for 2 months in the vastness of the prairie? True, he survived through the efforts of a badger, a wild animal considered amongst the fairest of the land for its size. Who, then, are we to say that a power far beyond this creature was not directing her? That a power far beyond her did not carefully set up the circumstances by which such a miracle could come to pass? And so this was how the word of Ben's recovery spread across the Manitoba country. Not unexpectedly, as events of such unusual interest do, the account that was so simple became embellished and, quote, improved upon, until the entire populace was quite convinced that a powerful Blackfoot chief named Midnusk had been passing through the country with this small band of followers on the day when little MacDonald boy wandered off and became lost. Chief Mittendusk had, so the story went now, not only saved the boy's life, but he had also adopted him as his own son and kept him safe until his band's travel brought them back to this area, whereupon he returned the child to his parents. There was even an additional and entirely unexpected sidelight to the embellishment. This great Blackfoot chief, so it was whispered, had come to the Winnipeg area seeking vengeance for wrongs done to him and his people by a huge black-bearded trapper. That this man had not been found, but his dog was, and that the dog was captured and slain in a gruesome manner as a sample of what was in store for the trapper. But this was secondary material and for the most part accepted as invention on someone's part. What was primary in the discussion of the people was the fact of Benjamin MacDonald's miraculous return, for which God and Chief Mittendusk were given credit. For the most part, people respected the announced wishes of the MacDonalds that they wanted no great personal fanfare to be made over Ben. The neighbors were genuinely pleased and happy for the family at the recovery of the boy, and they were only too glad that the family was discouraging visitors, since quite a number of them were more embarrassed than ever now for having so quickly given up the search. Yet there were still a few who came, ostensibly to pay their respects and extend their congratulations, but actually more to see this little child who had undergone such an extraordinary experience. As for Ben, a trace of his former shyness was still there where strangers were concerned, and he remained somewhat reticent about talking much to anyone outside the family. But he did surprise and delight Esther and William MacDonald by gravely shaking hands with visitors, even if he would not say very much to them. Their pleasure was even greater when Ben exhibited a marked anticipation for his entry into school less than a week from now, and the doubts that had assailed them so short a time ago in regard to his readiness for it had now dissolved. One major problem remained, the badger. Ben was unshakably determined that he would not go to school unless he could take her with him each day. And perhaps it was not even a matter of choice, for the big female badger still showed a strong determination to go wherever Ben went. This was the situation as matters were rapidly spiraling towards a new crisis. But then another visitor came to Hawks Hill. His name was George Burton.